Hello and welcome to the Champion Briefs topic analysis of the December 2021 topic, Resolved increase the United States federal regulation of cryptocurrency transactions and/or assets will produce more benefits than harm. I'm Srikar Satish. I'm going to walk you through this topic in a few steps. First, we're going to discuss how crypto works very briefly, inherency of the resolution itself, and then a topic breakdown of the resolution word for word, some circuit meta, and then affirmative and neg arguments and closing remarks. So let's get straight into it. So how does cryptocurrency work? Cryptocurrency is a form of decentralized finance that was developed in around 2009. It's become really mainstream in the past few years. And essentially how it works is similar to online transactions, where rather than things getting sent to bank information that banks doing the form of transactions, it happens through users. So what essentially happens is when a user tries to send Bitcoin or buy something through Bitcoin, it goes to a server, and that server will be recording those transactions. And they'll record it into issues known as blocks, where you have a group of a bunch of transactions. Every 10 minutes or so, those blocks are added to the chain, which is the global information that's been related to Bitcoin transactions. That's where the phrase blockchain comes from, which is a revolutionary new technology to make issues of data storage much better. Obviously, you don't want to go super in detail on how crypto works, why it happens, the lines of code, any of that. You want to keep it relatively brief, otherwise you're going to lose a lot of judges. So, with that said, we should talk about why this resolution even exists in the first place. So, a lot of harmful factors have been done with Bitcoin itself. For example, there's a lot of price volatility. For example, we saw Dogecoin just shot up in the market and went straight down because of the comments made about it, and it's not a very safe investment for investors because it's very volatile. But also, there's a lack of regulation on who can be able to access Bitcoin. For example, Al-Qaeda has about 15 Bitcoins in the market, which is a huge amount. So this is giving the need for the resolution to ask about regulations. But specifically, there has been some regulations that are occurring. Specifically under the Biden administration, the Security and Exchanges Commissions, the SEC, has increased the amount of regulation they're doing against Bitcoin, and they're trying to make sure that Bitcoin is being used in a sustainable way. So, the resolution is asking us for increased U.S. federal regulation of cryptocurrency transactions and assets. So let's break the resolution down word for word. So the first word that I think comes to mind is increased United States federal. It isn't a U.S. FG resolution, not the U.S. federal government. It's just federal. So this is regulation that's being happened by anywhere as part of the federal branch. It doesn't have to be the government. For example, you could argue a data sharing network that allows for all 50 states to be sharing a form of data. That'd be federal, for example. So here's the first point where I think a lot of teams will come up and define specific types of regulations that might or may not be done by Congress or by the SEC, for example. The second word I think that's important is regulation. And people who regulate crypto are assets, right? Crypto is a form of an asset. And right now, all the assets, except for crypto, is being regulated by the SEC. Obviously, moderately they came in. So this is going to be talking about who's going to be doing this regulation. I think the next big word that most people are complaining about is the and/or. And many teams, I suspect, would be complaining that this essentially asks them to break down three topics, right? That for breakdown, where the neg team has to defend assets, neg team has to defend transactions, and the neg team also has to defend both, right? Where you're basically debating three different topics, a general idea of regulation. I don't think this is the case, though. Obviously, the affirmative teams should try and leverage the and or to the best amounts, which we'll go to when we go to specific app arguments. But I think most of the literature talks about regulation generic enough that most teams wouldn't have a problem finding a link that applies to both. And obviously, we'll discuss those. But it allows for the ask to specifically come and say, I only want to regulate assets or only want to regulate transactions. And that's 100% allowed. Obviously, you want to make sure that your disads and neg do link into that. And interpretation of this resolution can go in a variety of ways because the next phrase will produce more benefits than harms. So this resolution doesn't really have an action word, right? Like, for example, the U.S. should do something, right? It's talking about increased. So I think the first way you can interpret this resolution is talking about the status quo. I think teams could come up and make an argument that the status quo regulations is what is being defended, right? So what the SEC is doing right now, they're expanding. I think they're doing their Section 5 as well. teams could come up and they could argue that, hey, this regulation is what we are going to defend, and that will produce more benefits than harms. This could be strategic in a few ways. First, there's a lot of literature on what's already happening, so you obviously are up on a form of a empiric level debate. Two, I think it could be strategic because a lot of neg teams will be expecting to go for dissets like, oh, this will happen immediately, but time frames just against their side. They have more long-term impacts. And also, it allows for easier topic research. You can figure out what's happening. Maybe you can find a specific action the SEC is doing that won't link into neg dissets. I think the second interpretation's resolution is about how it's asking for more increase. So we already have some regulations. It's saying an increase would lead to this. And what does that look like, that increase? I think that could result in obviously a lot of factors. Right now, obviously, the SEC is doing a bit. There's a little bit in the DOJ that's doing some things with crypto as well. So what can be going further? There's not a form of a standardization framework on how to regulate and enforce crypto. Like, courts are going crazy right now on like what crypto actually is. You could argue that federal regulation could actually be just Congress providing like a very sustainable data framework on like, here is the framework onto how you have to regulate crypto. This obviously wouldn't lead to many uncertainty because Congress is just telling you, hey, here's how you should regulate crypto. I think there's also an argument to be made about courts. How the SEC does its regulation is they sue people in courts. So federal regulation is technically just courts giving rulings. So you could technically argue that, hey, there's X case in the court. If you affirm the resolution, that court case needs to be decided a certain way, and you can argue impacts off that. That's obviously a much more squirrely interpretation of the resolution itself, but it's one that could work in front of some techie judges. I think the final way you could interpret this resolution is with the word federal. It doesn't talk about in the United States. It just says federal. So obviously this allows for teams to say, hey, federal regulation applies to other places as well. For example, there is, like I mentioned earlier, Section 5 of the SEC that talks about offshore assets. You could talk about how, hey, the SEC is going to apply this to cryptocurrency and make an entire debate about offshoring on AF or on NEG. I think this could also be strategic because you obviously have the access to the developing world first. You have the access to the economy stuff. So essentially, you could argue that these economies are more dependent. Cryptocurrency is a way out, or cryptocurrency makes it worse. There's plenty of debate to go along there. I think the next section we need to talk about is circuit meta. So obviously, whether people like it or not, techier aspects of debate are becoming NPF, and it's important to know how this topic relates to that. I think this topic is very strategic in that sense. What this means is people who want to read critical arguments, this is probably a really great topic to do it. Like I mentioned earlier, there isn't an action word here. It's just asking you to compare the benefits and harms. So I'm not saying that, hey, everyone should go read a critique. I'm saying for teams who want to do that, this is a way and a good topic to do it where you'd be able to read it in a way where you keep the public in public forum, you don't just lose them. The reason this is the case, you don't need to read an alt. Because the resolution is only asking for benefits or harms. For example, if we're talking about a capitalism critique, you could argue that, hey, increasing regulation of cryptocurrencies is a move to capitalism. It makes it a lot worse because capitalists hate crypto, whatever. Then you could argue that that's obviously bad. You don't have to argue that, hey, here's a form of solvency. You're just saying that there's going to produce harms, and now you always have to weigh the harms versus the benefits. So that's a really easy way for you to be able to keep these arguments accessible to every single person. And on this topic and the way it's phrased, it's really easy for you to do that, and it might be even a strategic benefit for you all to do that. So this is just a topic. And obviously the affirmative is really, really good here for these types of arguments as well, because especially when it comes to capitalism or when it comes to like neoliberalism, for example, you're regulating markets more. So you could obviously argue that the free market of Bitcoin does as much harms as like the K on the neg would do as well. And you'd be able to make some sort of comparison there. So thought I mentioned that because that's very much on the circuit meta. I think the other thing on circuit meta is going to be some sort of extinction frameworks. The way that people are reading them now is they're looking to impacts that essentially don't allow for people to access them. I think on this topic, that might not be the most strategic strategy because this topic, I think, comes down to a weighing of links. Essentially, you have the idea of economy. You have the, hey, the affirmative is going to solve uncertainty, now it's going to create more uncertainty. You have the idea of terrorism, where AF is like, hey, we're going to solve for terrorist financing. Next, going to be like, no, you don't really solve, and in fact, it even makes it worse because it allows for backdoor networks, all that stuff. So I think, and obviously there's the environment aspect. AF's like, if you regulate it, it's going to create environmental harms. So I think the only one where you can make it where it's hard to access is going to be the environment contention. But at the same time, I don't think it's the most strategic access when it comes to these cases. With that said, let's get into the arguments themselves. So let's start with AF. The most common AF argument is going to be the one about crime. So I'm splitting them up into two sections. I think you can talk about financial crimes, and you can also talk about physical crimes. So let's start with financial. There's a lot of money in cryptocurrency. There's about like $1.7 billion in crypto. And a lot of that should be taxable, but it's not right now. And especially what is happening right now, and is a possible interpretation of the resolution, is that there is a bill in Congress that's wanting to give the IRS. It says, hey, we'll give crypto data to IRS, and you're going to tax anything that's over 10,000, right? And you're going to go after them. So the IRS is going to make sure they can get tax revenue. This can lead to a lot of things, this IRS thing. One, we know that sharing of data within government branches is just really common, right? That happens. So if the IRS gets your data, any other place can use your data. So I think this could be used as a link to some sort of like terrorism argument. And you can obviously blow this up in rebuttal, or you can hide it in case, whatever you need to do. Because if data gets shared to the government, obviously the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, all these people can get access. So if terrorists or alt crime or drug dealers, whatever, they're buying their items to continue with cryptocurrency. If you're able to track the cryptocurrency, you're able to weed all that out. And obviously, I'll get to that more on there. I think the second way you do this, rather than just argue with the IRS, you can argue that regulation could be that you have taxable on crypto, because crypto doesn't really have that much taxable tax regulation. So you'd be like, hey, regulation is that crypto is an asset, you have to pay taxes on it, issues like that. I think the other crime argument is the physical crime argument. There's a lot of groups that are using crypto to buy, because crypto is not able to be tracked right now a lot by government agencies. And so, for example, Venezuela uses crypto to be able to buy to escape sanctions. Al-Qaeda has 15 bitcoins. ISIS uses bitcoins. It's how they finance their operations. So the argument would go that, hey, right now we see that these groups are buying crypto. Regulation means that, like I mentioned earlier, you collect data, but also B, it could mean policing, right? Regulation could be like, hey, you're going to go after people who actually buy Bitcoin. There's a lot of arguments. And there's a past topic that talks about this specifically. The 2020 policy topic talks about it. The 2021 college policy topic deals with antitrust. There's also some arguments when it comes to cryptocurrency. So there's definitely back files for you to look on here. Essentially, you're going to either have policing, you're going to have data sharing frameworks, or you can also go through and essentially figure out how people are going to be able to access it. So currently in crypto, I think this is the third link. There's a 3-link contention there if you need it. There's something called ICOs, or initial coin offerings. How initial coin offerings work is it's like an IPO. If you want to start up a startup, you get Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's be like, hey, here's some Bitcoin, but you have to use Bitcoin. So it allows Bitcoin to spread the market, but also it allows for groups to essentially anonymously get access to Bitcoin and financing. So this is how a lot of terrorist networks are being able to build up their terrorist networks. And so the argument would go that, and there's a lot of legislation right now talking about wanting to regulate ICOs, not IPOs. And so if you go through and you regulate these ICOs, figure out who can get them, maybe you have like some sort of background check for these ICOs, and figure out where people are actually coming from. This allows for you to have a much more safe crypto market. The second big argument on the AF deals with economy. So how it would go right now is there's a lot of investors, and crypto is just a super volatile market. Like one time, the price is super high, next day it's super low. This could be because of a lot of reasons. I think a very easy way, and this is also allows you to use the first argument to prereq this, obviously prereq the neg arguments as well, is because people are worried about crypto. It's seen as like a shady market where people use it to get shady materials, horrible actions. And so by using crypto and essentially by regulating crypto, it makes the United States look better. There's more confidence in the market. There's also the aspect of you going through and stabilizing the market through market stabilizers, essentially meaning that prices can't go too high or too low. That could be something done by the Treasury as well. And because of U.S. federal, that's something that could happen. Obviously, the econ impacts are pretty straightforward. Volatility is bad, it kills small businesses, all those other issues. I think the second econ argument that's pretty big is the small business argument. So cryptocurrency is kind of a monopoly right now. There's not a lot of small startups. It's very hard for them to get access to capital. Firming means you could do antitrust, essentially make sure that monopolies don't go too far. It's another interpretation of the resolution. I think the third big AF argument you all are going to see, especially given the TOC topic last year, so many people read this, was cryptocurrency, was actually environment, right? The environment says that cryptocurrency does a lot of emissions. Regulating it means you don't allow for emissions to go so high. Essentially like a tax not a tax, a cap on carbon for crypto. So you can't go too far. Obviously, there's a lot of legal crypto that could be hard to do that, and I don't think you get enough solvency with just the US. You're going to have to find really good evidence for that. So let's move to the neg arguments. There's obviously a few other AF arguments. These are just the big AF arguments and figuring out how they relate to each other. So the neg arguments, like I told the AF, you want to go really specific. Neg, you want to do the opposite. You want to go pretty generic on the neg and figure like things that link into AF in general. So I suggest a lot of your links should be about regulation in general. Obviously, the neg most stock argument here is going to be the uncertainty argument, or investors will get scared. Essentially, if you do regulation of crypto, investors get scared. There's a lot of things that happen here. Either A, investors get more uncertain, which increases volatility. I think this is an argument that's better left as a turn because you have this competing uniqueness question and you don't want to be going to it, and you don't basically every app is going to read an econ argument. So this is a better turn. But I think the better argument you read is something about offshoring. That's just like, hey, companies will go offshore. That's not going to be good for them. I think that's pretty straightforward. That happened in like South Africa. That happened in a bunch of other places. China's a perfect example of this. When China banned cryptocurrency, Chinese crypto went just abroad, basically. So I think you have good probability weighting there. You have very good access, and I think you can basically say you access the AF's inherency. So if you can refute a spillover claim saying that US won't spill over, you'd be like, well, the AF's impacts are just going to happen in other places. You not unique the AF. B, you turn the AF because it's probably worse in a low-income country. So this is probably a pretty fire neg strat, in my opinion. I think the other neg strategy that people have to look into is the idea of politics. So obviously, politics disads aren't super common in PF, but I think on this topic, especially with the political relevance, I could see a bunch of teams reading it. Crypto is something that's politically toxic. There's been a bunch of legislation that's been trying to get passed on crypto, and there's always dissonance, and people just don't want to be able to pass it. Both Republicans and Democrats. If you try and push it through Congress, that's going to mean that there's political backlash, and that might be on a specific bill that you might like, or whatever. And this argument is probably strategic in front of tech judges. Might be harder to get lay judges to buy it. But there's huge impacts off this. Basically, like we mentioned earlier with the extinction strategy, it's not super smart, but if you read this and you found a really niche extinction scenario, you should be able to be fine. So just wrapping up with just general ideas, right? Obviously, the AF, let's go specific, neg doesn't want to, but specifically when it comes to the weighing, right? The neg is going to be trying to win on time frame. Like, hey, AF regulations take a while to actually implement. Neg uncertainty claims, neg disads happen immediately. So the AF has to beat back that question of like just the higher order weighing. I think secondly, the other issue the AF has to beat back is that the AF has to, I think, just argue that the neg doesn't link into the AF, right? Because I know in policy it's like plan, disad. You want to kind of treat this resolution like that. Because if you say, hey, the resolution is going to be enacted like this, the neg doesn't get access to enacting it like that, round is over. So I think those are the strategies the team wants to do. Obviously, with November being one of the most techier seasons where you have Florida Blue Key now, you also have UT, you have Princeton, more techie tournament, you might see a lot of these new circuit meta arguments and also more techie arguments. So I think the way teams get ready with that is just to have really solid weighing pre-written, and they should be fine for most of the season. Finally, I'd like to shout out the Champion Briefs for making excellent briefs that y'all can check out for more information on any of this subject if you want.